Just 25 days out from Election Day in November, and Donald Trump now leads in all but one of the 7 toss-up battleground states ahead of November's election. So this is a pretty big development considering the fact that just a month ago, Kamala Harris led in the majority of battleground states in places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, even North Carolina was sort of teetering on the edge. But now the only state where Kamala Harris maintains a lead is the state of Wisconsin. So in today's video, we're going to talk about the polling this election cycle. We'll talk about some of the latest polls and where this election is headed just less than a month from election day. So we're going to go through the various battleground states, and we're also going to take a look at demographical data and base it on the 2020 exit polls, because the Pew Research actually put out a pretty comprehensive poll broken down by various demographics, and we have some data to compare it to when it comes to the 2020 election. So we're going to get to all of that in just a second, but first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So obviously, for starters, Kamala Harris leads the RCP national average by 1.8. So this is down slightly from where she was a few weeks ago when she had her high point of around 2.2. That was pretty much her highest lead over Donald Trump. And since then, it's sort of stagnated, and now it's basically back to 1.8. So again, this is less of a lead than Hillary Clinton had at this point in the election in 2016. And it's way less of a lead than what Joe Biden had at this point in the election season 4 years ago. So, of course, this is probably good news for Donald Trump. If polling is being conducted the same way it was in 2016 and 2020, this would be fantastic news for Donald Trump, because it would mean that he was probably on track to win the popular vote, considering the fact that in 2016 and in 2020, you had several points in terms of a margin of error in which the polls underestimated Donald Trump's support. But this time around, the opposite concern is what has been prevailing in the political sphere, which is that the polls are actually overestimating Republican support like they did in 2022. So that's really going to be the million-dollar question, whether or not these averages are going to underestimate or overestimate Donald Trump's support. Because if they overestimate Donald Trump's support, that means Kamala Harris has a several point lead in every battleground state and is going to go on to win the election fairly easily, although it will still be somewhat close. Now, if the polls underestimate Donald Trump, that would mean he's on track to win the battlegrounds by several points, which would basically put him over his 2016 Electoral College victory total, meaning he won fairly decisively in the Electoral College. So obviously, that question is not going to be answered until after the election, but we can look at these polls to briefly see how the race has been trending so far. So we'll start off with Pennsylvania, which I think is the most important state this election. Whichever candidate wins Pennsylvania is likely going to win the White House. That was also the case back in 2020. Now, originally, several months ago, I had thought Wisconsin was going to be the most important battleground state, but when you take a look at Pennsylvania, it's 19 Electoral College votes. And really, Trump or Harris, if they win Pennsylvania, only needs to win North Carolina and Georgia in order to become president, or a various combination of the other battleground states. But this is probably the easiest path. It's also because these states have the most Electoral College votes. So this state is the state I'd be watching the most on election night. Pennsylvania, maybe North Carolina, and probably Georgia. Michigan's also an interesting one. We're going to talk about all 7 of these battleground states way more in depth before the election. But if we take a look at the polls as they are now, Donald Trump is up in Pennsylvania by 0.4. Now, recently, over the past month or so, going back to September, Kamala Harris had a very narrow lead in Pennsylvania. Now Donald Trump has an incredibly narrow lead. Now, this is a huge contrast to where the election was right before Joe Biden dropped out. Trump was up in Pennsylvania by 5 points. So even if there was a midterm type swing towards the left, underestimating Democratic support, Trump still probably would have won Pennsylvania. I doubt the polling miss would have been as big as 5 points. In Pennsylvania in 2022, Dr. Oz was up by less than a point in the state, and John Fetterman almost won by 5 points. So that goes to show you how big of a miss you would need in order to flip the result. So again, this just highlights why the Democrats were incredibly smart in switching out Joe Biden, because had they not, Trump was probably on track for an Electoral College landslide, which is why months ago I was making videos talking about such scenarios, because it was somewhat in the realm of possibility, though I think a lot of people were getting carried away with places like Virginia, New Mexico, Minnesota, so on and so forth. But anyway, this race has certainly swung towards Trump's direction. If we take a look at North Carolina, Donald Trump leads here by 0.5%. Now, this is typically one of the most right-leaning of the 7 battleground states. In fact, in 2020, North Carolina was the only battleground state on this map that Donald Trump won, with all the other battleground states going to Joe Biden by about 2 points or less. So all of these states were incredibly close. But North Carolina lately has been showing a pretty consistent lead for Donald Trump, although it is a very small one. In fact, Michigan, surprisingly enough, as we're going to get to, has the largest lead for Donald Trump at 0.9%. But again, this is just like Pennsylvania, 6-point lead for Donald Trump in North Carolina before Joe Biden dropped out of the race, and then it quickly narrowed up because I think we're starting to come back to political reality. This race is going to be incredibly close. Even if Kamala Harris wins the popular vote by 3 or 4 points, I think in the battleground states you're going to see very tight results just because it's going to be incredibly polarizing. Turnout is going to be a huge factor, and ultimately, the race has just fundamentally changed since Kamala Harris has entered. But now if we take a look at Michigan, many are pointing to the disaffected Muslim vote in Michigan as the reason for Donald Trump's nearly 1-point lead, which is actually his first lead in the state since June or July. So it's been several months since Donald Trump has led in the aggregate. Kamala Harris consistently led here by 2 points, so on and so forth. And, you know, this is really interesting because Michigan is 15 electoral votes. It's incredibly important. And this disaffected Muslim vote could potentially hand Donald Trump the state incredibly narrowly. Again, he won the state back in 2016 by 0.3%. In 2020, Joe Biden won the state by nearly 3 points. So it was the most leftward of all these battleground states. And really, this is probably going to lead to decreased Democratic support in places like Wayne, Ann Arbor, and these other areas, whereas Kamala Harris might technically stave that off with better margins in the suburbs. So this pretty much backs up what a lot of people have been saying, that Donald Trump is going to have the best share of the minority vote yet, even better than 2020. That doesn't mean he's going to win. White voters are still the majority of the electorate, and Kamala Harris in some polls is doing better with suburban white voters with a college degree than even Joe Biden was, and those voters typically have higher turnout. So that's why we're really talking about this being the toss-up of toss-ups, because under normal circumstances, when you lead with that demographic by that much, you're going to win the election. But Donald Trump's improvement with minority voters is the reason why this race has gotten so close. And Michigan is really ground zero for that when you're talking about places like Wayne County, neighborhoods like Dearborn, for example, that are Muslim majority. Depressed turnout among these groups could be catastrophic if this result comes down to just a few thousand votes. You know, even if Kamala Harris wins Grand Rapids by 8 points, you know, if she brings Wayne County down to just a, 66-33 margin, that's pretty bad for her overall. But that's the state of Michigan. Now, if we take a look at the state of Georgia, this is another incredibly important state. This is one of the few states where the polling has been fairly solid from 2020, 2022, and potentially even this November as well. Donald Trump was up in Georgia by 4.7 in the RCP average in 2016 at this point. He ended up winning the state by 5. Trump was up by 0.4 in 2020. He ended up losing the state by 0.2%. And again, that was at this point in time in the election. Joe Biden didn't take the lead in Georgia till very, very late. Now, this state was incredibly close as soon as Kamala Harris became the nominee, and Donald Trump really didn't start opening up a lead until about a month ago, less than a month ago. So it's been several weeks. But if this momentum continues, and it looks like it's starting to dip down again for Donald Trump, he's only up by 0.5 now, this is a critical battleground for him to win. Again, this was the closest state in 2020 in terms of the margin of the vote. Donald Trump only lost here by 0.2%. And, this is really a must win. If Donald Trump can't win the state of Georgia, let's say, he would need North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and then he would need one other battleground state, whether that be Wisconsin, Arizona, or Nevada. And so far, Donald Trump is leading in all of those states besides Wisconsin, but they're by the thinnest of margins. And again, if the polling misses what we saw in 2022, that means Kamala Harris is probably going to win all these battlegrounds by several points. And it really all comes down to suburban turnout and whether or not Donald Trump can make more inroads with suburban voters. And so far, I haven't seen the case for that. because all of the elections since 2022 have shown massive suburban erosion for the GOP. One, because of abortion, and two, because of sort of the Trump candidates that just really aren't compatible with this demographic. College-educated suburban voters do not like these types of candidates, and they certainly don't like the messaging they get from these candidates, and that was something that was made very clear in 2022. So looking now at the overall Pew Research poll, and this is really fascinating because it actually gives us a pretty comprehensive demographic breakdown, and the sample size is over 4,000 voters. So I think it's a pretty good gauge as to where this race is right now. Kamala Harris leads Donald Trump by 1 point. This is, again, national. This is for the entire country. When you look at white voters, Donald Trump is up by 14 points. In 2020, Donald Trump won white voters by 17 points. So you're starting to see a dip in support with that demographic. Among black voters, Harris is up 79-14. That's an improvement certainly on 87-12 for Joe Biden. And again, this poll is not going to be exactly accurate. Harris is going to get a much higher share of the black vote than this. But, you know, Donald Trump at 14%, that does seem pretty realistic with the data that we've been getting so far. Among Latinos, Harris is up 54-38. If we take a look at how they voted in 2020, 65-32. So that shows a pretty big improvement among Latinos for somebody like Donald Trump being at 38%. That would be pretty incredible. But again, it doesn't mean that much when Donald Trump has a smaller margin of victory among white voters. Asian voters, 62-30 for Harris. In 2020, they were 61-34 for Joe Biden. When we look at male to female, Donald Trump leads among male voters by 8 points back in 2020. And again, keep in mind, males have a slightly smaller turnout than females. Females make up 52% of the electorate, males only 48%. If we take a look at women voters support Kamala Harris 52-43. 42, that's basically the number we saw for Trump in 2020. 57 was the number for Joe Biden. Kamala Harris is currently at 52. And again, give or take, this is going to be off by several points. I don't expect this to be the exact margins these voting groups tend to go by. When you look at 18 to 29-year-olds, Trump's at 34% among that group. If we take a look at the exit polls here, he was at 36. So you see a slight drop there. Pretty bad news for Trump. Kamala Harris is up with ages 30 to 49-year-old voters by 1 point. Donald Trump lost that demographic by 6. So you're seeing an improvement there. That could indicate a shift to the right among sort of older millennial voters. Trump leads 50 to 64-year-olds, 52 to 45. You can't really find an exact comparison with this exit poll just because the age differential they use is a little different, but 65 and over, 52-47, that's pretty much the same as what we're seeing in this Pew Research poll. Postgraduates going to Harris 62-33, that's really not a shock. College graduates going to Harris by 9 points, and non-college going to Trump 56-39. What I think is most interesting about this poll is that when you look at voters who did not vote in 2020, Donald Trump actually leads that group by 1 point, which means that it could bear to be that Donald Trump does better when there's higher turnout and when you have more people that didn't previously vote start voting in this election. So when we look at places like Virginia, for example, where you have a 20% increase in people who've never voted before, in Western Virginia, that's certainly probably going to help Donald Trump. So that's really showing you that the operation to mobilize these low propensity voters for the Republicans and Trump is actually working, and that could be why this election is so close. Also, I think it's noteworthy that when you look at Republicans and lean Republicans, Trump gets 89% of that vote. Harris gets 6, and then when you take a look at the inverse, 91% of Democrats, only 4% going to Donald Trump. So that's really surprising. That shows you that there's a slightly larger number of Republicans that are voting for Kamala Harris than Democrats voting for Donald Trump. Obviously, we'll see if that's the case. The Republican primaries may have indicated that. And again, this could also tie into sort of the suburban erosion regarding Donald Trump. But this is really the state of the race right now. Donald Trump leads narrowly in the battlegrounds, and the demographical data shows that Kamala Harris is doing a little bit better with educated voters and white voters. Donald Trump is doing better with minority voters. And I think in that scenario, Kamala Harris would narrowly win because white suburban voters have higher turnout, and, you know, they're going to be the higher propensity voting bloc. So that's the state of the race right now, 25 days out from Election Day. If you haven't liked this video and you enjoyed, please leave a thumbs up down below. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any more updates. We're going to dive soon into the updated early vote totals, so be sure to check that out. And always, again, if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel if you're new. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.